Hi, this is Carson with Troy, and I have with me James J. Butcher. Now, James' debut novel, Dead Man's Hand, came out last October. Get in the frame here. Fantastic book. And the second novel I looked up is coming out this October. Is that correct? Long Past Dues.
That's correct. Yeah, it should release right at about the same time, just a year later from the first one.
Awesome. So, James, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself.
Well, my name's James J. Butcher. I've recently become an author. I've been writing for a while, but only recently has anything been worth reading. Yeah, I'm just mostly just a big nerd that I like telling stories. I like making things, and for the most part, there's only one of those two that I can make a living off of so far. So I'm going to focus on the writing aspect.
Perfect. Now, you said you've been, writing for a while. Obviously, like not everybody gets picked up the same rate. Everybody has their different struggles. What's been kind of the process for you to being picked up to have your first novel released?
For those that don't know, my dad's a fairly well-known author as well. And so when I decided I wanted to be an author, I knew that essentially I've had the crossroads of going under a pen name or not. Since I decided I want to keep my real name, I knew that there was going to be certain different hurdles and a lot of other hurdles that weren't going to be as big of an issue for me. And so I kind of went in knowing that when I wrote something that was worth publishing, it would be fairly easy to get some eyes to look at it. So I focused my efforts not on being visible, but on just trying to improve the quality of what I was writing, so I could get to a point where I could go to somebody in the industry that I knew and just say, "Hey, can you take a look at this and tell me if you think it's worth take editing or going into the editing process and submitting to be published?" And so, I mean, I wrote for uh 8 or 9 years before I actually took my manuscript to anybody. And when I found an editor to take a look at it, they immediately wanted to pick it up. So I just tried to focus on writing something that people wanted to read over writing something that would be visible.
So, 8 or 9 years, that's a long time writing. Was this particular book, did it go through different iterations, or was like how
Well,
how was that process? Has it
this
changed
book
much?
Yeah, well, this book is book number 7 that I actually wrote. So I wrote 7 books over the course of the 8 or 9 years, and most of them will never see the light of day. The very first one I wrote, I actually was so proud of it. I printed it off, and it lives in a dusty corner of my closet. That one's going to also stay locked away, but it's just god awful. But that's the first book I got to put the end on, so it still has a special place in my heart for that. But no, I wrote several different books in several different settings. The very first thing I wrote was an epic fantasy setting. I wanted to write some epic fantasy stuff. But as I got more and more aware of not just the process of writing, but also the more of the industrial side of writing, of like finding an audience and appealing to readers and tropes of genres, things like that. As I became more and more conscious and aware of those, it became a much larger decision point of what genre I wanted to write in. And because of I had 3, I think it was, that I really wanted that I would kind of more or less equal in the running to be the first book I was writing to be published. Um, and there was my urban fantasy series, which is the one that did get published. Bit of a spoiler of which one I decided to go with, I suppose. Then I had a epic fantasy that was kind of the percolations from the very first book I wrote, and then I had a post-apocalyptic story I wanted to write. But because of my namesake, I kind of had the idea that I'd have a certain reader base, and they would have a certain genre preference from the get-go. And so I decided just to lean into that and write more urban fantasy stuff, because the folks that would likely be picking up my book, a great number of them already enjoyed that. So I figured, why not write stuff people enjoy?
That's awesome. Then I thought it was a wise decision. It's a very good book. I really liked it. And your dad is very famous, and sometimes there's that I don't want to be, I don't want to be like my dad, like kids go through that stage. You're old enough
Sure.
to where like you're probably out of that stage. But um and that could be a certain hurdle, because it'd be like, oh, you're leaning into what your father wrote and things like that. But this book is so well written and so well done that you if your dad didn't exist, like this, if this was out on the market, like people would be drawn to it and be like, oh my gosh, like this is amazing. So you did a very good job of separating yourself from anything that your father has done.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So let's talk about this story. I mean, this if somebody picks this up and wants to become a writer, I think this is a master class because I think, like you said, you there's certain tropes that you use, and tropes are important when telling stories because people have an idea of what you a story should be. So I mean, you have let's just talk about your I'm going to call them the three protagonists, even though there's some ancillary ones. But Griswold Grimsby is kind of a down on his luck wannabe magician at full at a fast food restaurant. Um, and that's kind of a trope where you it's kind of like the farm boy, right? He's kind of not living the where he wants to be. um he has some magical abilities, but he only can do two spells. I'm not going to go into them. You can go into them if you want. What
Yeah.
sort of decisions did you kind of go in there? Why two? Why not more, three or four or five or whatnot? I mean, I think limitations make things a little bit more interesting, but why did you settle on those and those particular spells?
So like one of the coolest parts about urban fantasy is magic, right? That's the main part that people are drawn to, and how that changes the world that they live in and their perception of it. And it's really easy with magic to go overboard and just have every problem be able to be solved by throwing a fireball at it or something similar. And so and I'm a big D&D player, and I will forever scorn the wizard in my party that hit third level and didn't take fireball. Like it's the go-to spell. And so I wanted a main character that he would face a lot of problems, and many of them could be solved by something as blunt as a fireball, and he doesn't have access to that. And I backpedaled from that a little bit and thought more about, well, if he can't solve, if he doesn't have fireball, what else doesn't he have? And it ended up being he used to have like three or four very broadly versatile spells. And I found that was very boring because every problem he encountered was solved by just the most obvious application of a spell. And so I kept taking magic away from him essentially until he was left with just two very fundamental mechanics. And those are both basically one spell pulls two objects together, and the other spell turns objects in a direction. And so finding creative ways for him to apply those spells was a lot more fun than it was to just have him have the right tool for the job in the toolbox. Having him struggle with an inappropriate tool and still get the job done is way more interesting to write and to read.
Exactly. And that's what I said earlier, like having limitations and how a character and how a writer can lean into that and figure things out creatively is just so much fun and so interesting that you just kind of have to keep reading and be like, oh man, he's in this situation, but he can only do these two things. How on earth can he solve the problem with these two limitations? So that was amazing. Now your second character, your protagonist, Leslie. I keep saying Wallflower in my head, but it's Mayflower.
Mayflower, yeah,
Yeah,
Mayflower.
Mayflower. Now he's kind of like the mentor type. I call him an anti-mentor. Like he's just kind of thrown in
Right.
there. He, I don't want to give any spoilers, but like he's kind of thrown in this situation, and he kind of has to make a tough decision right off the bat, and kind of takes Grimsby under his wings, um, or is it wing? Now you could have gone in a different direction, like the willing sort of mentor, but this guy doesn't want to be there. He's kind of dragging Grimsby along most of the way. Um, so that was a fun character as well. Like, how did he develop in your head?
Well, I always am drawn to strong mentee mentor relationships. Like I always find that dynamic very interesting, especially the more differed the two personalities are. When you have two characters that are just so different in so many ways, and one of them has a lot to teach the other, and that's the obvious mentor. It's really fun to also invert that dynamic and have the student be able to teach the mentor some stuff along the way as well. Um, so I knew going in that I wanted the two of them to be very opposite of one another. And so, for instance, Grimsby's a witch. He knows magic, and that's one of kind of his main contribution to most conflicts. And Mayflower is essentially a witch hunter, and he obviously doesn't have any magic. He uses, iron and steel and mostly guns to deal with his problems. And so the obvious things that a mentor would teach in a lot of these kind of books and settings is, your wizard mentor teaches you how to better use your magic, and obviously that's not something that can happen in this scenario. And so the things that they end up teaching each other are less about their areas of martial competency and more about emotional development of one another and how to survive in a dangerous world. And so Mayflower was fun to design because Grimsby was my starting point, and I just thought to myself, all right, what is the opposite of Grimsby in every respect? And so Grimsby's a little short, Mayflower's very tall. Grimsby has a cool name, Mayflower does not. Grimsby is very nervous and in unprepared for the world and environment he's in. Mayflower has seen everything he's experiencing a dozen times before at least. And so creating that character that was just so grizzled was a lot of fun because it just was so fresh compared to the kind of the fresh fledgling character.
Right. And another dynamic is Grimsby has scars and Mayflower has, see, I keep wanting to say Wallflower. Mayflower has emotional scars. And like that's
Right.
one of the cool things that in that book you bring out. Like Grimsby is kind of whining and Mayflower's like, so everybody deals with this, like get over it. And so like that was kind of an emotional mentor thing that he was able to teach. And then the third one, I love this character Wudge, and he kind of reminds me of kind of a Cheshire Cat style character. Like,
Sure.
how did you come up with him?
Well, first off, I just want to point out I got my very first fan art at Phoenix Fan Con, and it was of Wudge, and
Oh, nice.
that's fantastic to me. But Wudge was an interesting character because I saw I follow Pinterest boards or just scroll through Pinterest occasionally. And I just saw this picture of like a goblin looking dude, very depressed on a ledge and just with long draping like feet and toes. And I was like, oh, that image just stuck in my head, and I started kind of playing around with it, and I started adding little features to it because Wudge is not himself a goblin, and I didn't want him to have some of those iconic features. And so I wanted someone that was small and depressed and mischievous, and that was basically his kind of three go-to characteristics. And he's got for those that haven't read it yet, he's a small creature from another world essentially in a lot of ways, and he wears a onion on his head as a helmet that he has clawed the eyes out and sees through the gouges in the onion. And he was just such a fun character to create because there was nothing off the table for that kind of character. Like the idea of wearing an onion as a helmet is kind of an absurdity, but at the same time, it works for that character because he is so alien. I don't have to justify anything, which is, as a writer, super fun to be in that position, because usually you got to set up all the support structure for why the world allows this and why the characters think the way they do. And for Wudge, I don't have to do any of that. Wudge, I could just do what I feel like would be fun in the moment, and it still works pretty well.
It was a fun character to read. I really liked Wudge a lot. I'm sure you've had, well, I don't know. I would assume that you might have had, a good reaction fan base from that character. I mean, you said you got
The
fan art from it.
Yeah, if people tell me they like a character, that it's usually Wudge they're talking about.
Right. So, I mean, let's talk about Phoenix Fan Fusion. It was your first convention.
That's right.
Um, what what did you learn and what did you find valuable of doing a convention like that?
Well, it was I have been to conventions before, just not as an attending professional. So this was my first one where people there were there to see me, or at least some people were, which was very bizarre. But I had my very first panel and sat up there and mostly rambled and tried not to ramble too much because I tend to overtalk when I'm nervous, a lot like the Grimsby does in my books, because that's really easy for me to replicate. And so it ended up being like, I went in super nervous, but the more I talked to, the more folks asked questions, the more confident I felt, and it was ended up being a lot of fun. I mean, it was still exhausting because I'm not exactly the most social person in my day to day, and so interacting with people 3 solid days in a row was I was just happy to be home come Sunday night, But it was still it was enjoyable, and I'm glad I did it.
That's fun. I mean, you I watched one panel, I think, and you did amazing. It was the magic systems, like the hard versus soft magic, and
Yeah, I
um,
think that was the first one actually.
yeah, I think so too. And you were articulate enough, unlike me, that my cousin who wasn't planning on buying the book, but ended up buying the book. So
That's awesome.
it
Yeah,
was
that
it was pretty cool.
that was always one of the more genuine compliments when somebody they said, I wasn't gonna read your book until I heard you talk. And I was like, okay, I feel justified and in my confidence a little bit.
No, that's and the signing that I was at, you had a pretty good line. So people are you're getting the word out somehow, and people are finding your book. So that's got to be as a writer who wants to sell books, when you see that line forming,
Yeah.
that's got to be exciting.
Yeah, I think we actually sold out of my books that weekend. So
No, that's exciting. Yeah, I was glad I was able to pick up a book when I did. So
yeah,
um,
definitely.
now you said you're not very social. Granted, a lot, I'd say most science fiction and fantasy fans and authors are more kind of introverted. So, what sort of writing habits today? What's a day in the life of James J. Butcher?
So for me, I try to make a habit of focusing on consistency over intensity. And so for the most part, my writing sessions are 1 to 2 hours long, and I get, 1,000 words is like a good benchmark goal for me. And I try to do that every single day. And obviously there's days I miss because, whatever, because life gets in the way somehow or another. And then there's some days where I feel particularly like inspired to write, and I write in closer to 3, 4, maybe 5,000 words. But the important part is, in my opinion, the consistency of the writing on a daily basis, rather than just the being inspired to write, because you can't rely on that inspiration. And so I try to build writing into my daily habits so that it's something that I just do without thinking about it much. And so I'm kind of a night owl. So I usually right about midnight I'll sit down, turn off every screen in the house outside my laptop, pop in a couple of headphones and play some usually instrumental music, and then just sit in front of my computer. And I got nothing else I can be doing besides writing for a couple hours. And usually I won't do anything for 15 or 20 minutes. I'll just stare at a blank page or stumble on what I want to start the chapter with. And then once I kind of get moving, by the end of that 2 hours, I've got my goal done, and I can just feel validated for the day as a writer. And I think building it into the daily habits is the most important thing.
Now, you touched on a point where I think the majority of authors that I've interviewed have said consistency is king. Like you have to do something every day in order to progress your goals. And 1,000 words is fantastic. Like if you can do 1,000 words every single day, that's 365,000 words in a year. Like
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
like I don't know how. Like I'm guessing this is probably about 120,000, somewhere around there. Is
Yeah, it's
that
a little over 100,000, maybe 110 thereabouts.
yeah, so like I mean that's three books that you can put out a year. Obviously there's other aspects to writing, there's
Sure.
editing and different things, but if somebody that's just starting out and can do that consistency, 365,000, like that's three novels that they can come out with and learn a lot from each one. I mean, you said your first novel, it was the first novel, you were able to put the end on it, right? Like
Yeah.
that's a big key for lots of people to just finish something.
Yeah, and I still remember that book and that story. The other, like the six or the other five books between that book and the one I actually published, I don't remember a damn thing about most of them. Oh, sorry, excuse me.
That's
Uh,
okay.
but that first story, because I got to put the end on there, it was something different. Even though it wasn't very good, it was still something special.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you don't take anything else from this interview, other than buy James's book and be consistent in your writing, like you've gotten your money's worth of gold right here. So, I noticed a guitar, behind you, um, and you listen to instrumental music as you're writing. Who are some of your favorite bands? And this is just thrown out there. Like, who are some of your favorite bands that inspire you?
Well, when I write, I try to pick music that is like usually the most inoffensive, like in terms of like how much of my headspace it takes up, which is why I lean towards instrumental music. I turn the volume down pretty low, so it's not like, blaring and distracting. Like I just kind of want to be able to focus on other stuff. And so I don't pay too much attention to what I have on while I'm writing. But when I'm thinking about how to make stories, or when because most of the time I'm listening to music, I'm usually at the gym. At that point, like my headspace is pretty much free. And so the music that I'm listening to and the stories that I'm writing kind of start to coalesce and coincide. And so I listen to a lot of, I really like covers that are performed by people that are very different than the original artist. Like the quintessential example of that is Johnny Cash's "Hurt." His version of the song "Hurt," and was it Nine Inch Nails' version of the song? The original is very different than his version,
Right.
either way, and it's a very different experience, and it puts a different perspective and spin on the same words. But I like whole swaths of genres of music. I wouldn't say I'm too particular. I like country a lot, mostly like what is his name? Tyler Childers. He's one of my favorites lately. I like some of his faster songs. I like rap quite a bit. I listen to a lot of Eminem when I'm working out, especially. But I wouldn't say I have like a particular like favorite band, favorite genre. It's more of like the lyrics of the songs are really what get to me, because I'm a words guy.
Hmm.
And so if the words of the song have a certain poetry to them or a certain message to them that resonates with me, then I'll just listen to that song on repeat. I'm that kind of guy where I have like, I'll cycle through a playlist of 30 songs over the course of a year. 5, 6 of them will change, it just slowly evolves in the playlist, but I'll listen to that same stuff over and over again.
That's funny. That's how I am. I don't get tired of songs very easily. Like if I like
Yeah.
something, especially if I'm working out or something. You said you sit down and write, and you can stare at a blank page for 15, 20 minutes before you start. Do you, I mean, there's a couple ways to phrase this, but like, are you a plotter? Like, do you do an outline, or do you more free write? How's your process?
I'm a big fan of what I like to call like milestone writing, where I essentially, I'm at the gym, I'm listening to a song, I'm working out, and then an idea pops in my head for just a cool image, for some random thing. Like, I mean, the whole Grimsby series, or the Unorthodox Chronicle series, started from me having the image of a wizard having a real fight with real monsters on top of a plastic castle. And I built in the entire story off from that one image. And so when I do think of those images in my head that are just cool visually, or concepts that are cool and don't make a lot of sense, I set them up as milestones in my writing, and I kind of sit down and I could see the milestone in the distance, be like, okay, how do I get from from here to there? And I start structuring like literally the shape of the universe of the story around supporting my progression from point A to point B, because I know what point B is going to be. Um, I don't generally have a lot of the small stuff planned out, but I do. Those big keystone moments are ones that I really just kind of build the stories around. So I like knowing what I want the story to look like, and in 100 pages and 200 pages by the end. But I don't like knowing what I want the story to look like in 5 pages. I don't want to plan the short term as much. I want to have the creative flexibility to kind of just go in a direction if I think it's fun or cool. But that direction needs to be towards one of those milestones, so I don't get too off track and just kind of end up having a 200,000 word book when I'm supposed to have 100,000.
That's kind of funny because I've talked to lots of authors now. I think you're my 72nd interview, I think. And people will say they're outliners and explain to me exactly what you just said on how they're outlining. Like they'll just do, kind of these key moments. And people will say, "Oh no, like I'm totally just a pantser." And they'll explain
Yeah.
to me, "Oh, I just have these milestones that I go through." So like this, it's kind of funny, like the different people will look at it in a different lens.
Yeah, just their perspective is different. I always consider my approach to be a little bit more of a hybrid thing. But again, most people I talk to, they all right, it's kind of my same experience as yours, where they describe what I describe in a slightly different set of terminology, but it's pretty much the same thing.
Yeah. And, you know, that's kind of fun as a writer too, because you're not tied down to anything, and as you're writing, there's surprises, right? Like you're writing and your character does something, you're like, oh man, I didn't even know that was
Yeah,
going to happen, but it's funner like that.
yeah, for sure. That creative freedom and structure combined, I think, makes for good storytelling, especially from the creative's perspective, because it gives you some guidelines, but it doesn't restrict you too much. So it helps you get the work done at the end of the day.
Right. Now this is, oh man, did you say the eighth book or ninth book that you finished?
The very first book was my seventh. The first book
Okay,
I published was my seventh.
your seventh book. Now, what are some of the things that you kind of learned along the way? Now, I have a problem with reining characters in. Like characters just kind of go off on their own, and I'm like, okay, you're way out in left field. How am I going to rein this back in? Now, that's just something that I've kind of learned. What are some things that you've learned that you found? Okay, this is my weakness. I've strengthened this. This is my strength. Like I'm going to lean into that.
For me, I mean, I think every writer has their pitfall tendencies when they're starting that they have to kind of, gain some self perspective on to fix. For me, because I'm an only child, and I grew up playing video games by myself for the most part. Outside of like when I started actually making friends in middle school and so on, I tend to write loner characters a lot. And loner characters are just really boring. They don't interact with other people. They don't talk to other people. The dialogue isn't there. So the story feels very slow paced and drags its feet because you're focused on description and introspection. And that's just so dull. And it took me like 4 books to figure that out. Like, I'm not the most self aware individual, but so that was one of my big pitfalls, was writing loner characters that just didn't interact with people enough, didn't have enough conflicts with other people around them, and didn't have enough emotional engagements and attachments to the people around, which made it very difficult for a reader to gain perspective on a story, especially if you're writing in an alien environment like epic fantasy, because that's one of the things that grounds the reader is, even if it's a knight and a princess, if they have a romantic interest in one another, that's something that most readers can have some sort of empathetic connection with, or empathic connection with, because they've been in a similar parallel experience, just in a different world. And so when you take away that emotional element from stories with alien settings, it's just one more hurdle you've given yourself really to overcome to get your readers to be invested in your story. And there's a whole slew of those that, if I thought about it, I could probably dig up, of my own personal mistakes and pitfalls that I have tendencies towards. But I think a good chunk of them have been ironed out, and mostly now I have actual literal word pitfall tendencies, where I tend to use the same phrase occasionally in a book way too much and things like that. And that's kind of, I like to think that I'm getting to the point in my professional skill level that like those smaller issues are my bigger issues to deal with, because I've kind of conquered a lot of the fundamentals.
Well, that's something people might not realize is in their day-to-day life, they'll say the same phrase over and over. And when they put that in a book, they don't realize that they're doing that until
Yeah.
like that's why you kind of have editors and they're like, okay, like you're saying this a lot. Like
Yeah, editors
you need
can
to fix
be
this.
a godsend for that. In my second book, I just finished like one of the larger rounds of edits on, and for whatever reason, the phrase for me, "for a moment," I wrote that thing like 180 times over the course of the book. It was way too much, and I ended up having to trim so many of them and find alternative phrasings and things like that. And by the time I got to the end, I was so sick and repeated it so much. And then I wrote a scene at the very end of the book that I wasn't going to include before. And I was like, I mean, it's like, 4 or 5 paragraphs long. And I go back to the start of that scene, literally the first 3 words, "for a moment." I just like head planted onto my keyboard. I was so disappointed with myself.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's funny. Now, going back to, you said you wrote about loner characters. Really, like you got around it with this first book is because you had 2 loner characters, but you put them together and they had such an interesting dynamic that's one tip or trick that somebody can do if they're finding a way. Like we'll use loner characters, and they could be 2 outgoing characters or 2 depressed characters or whatever. But if you put 2 of them together and they're different enough that their dynamic can feed off each other and make for a very interesting pairing as they go on throughout their book. And another thing you said was conflict. Like a story kind of has to have conflict to make it interesting.
For sure. Yeah, and I think that's also something important to be said is that when you have those weaknesses as a writer, your goal is not necessarily to eliminate them entirely, but rather how to figure out how to turn them into strengths for yourself. And so, because it took me 4 books to figure out I only write loner characters, I had 4 more books of experience writing loner characters. And so understanding why those characters didn't work, but still taking in the parts of those characters that did work and incorporating them as the protagonists in a story, it really kind of eliminated a lot of the weaknesses of that that personal pitfall of mine, but still kept the strengths that I think it gave me.
No, exactly. And like I said, you did a fantastic job at doing that. So
Thank you.
that wasn't wasted effort. So lots of people think that, oh man, I wrote 4 novels. Like it's just throw them away and that's it. Like take that stuff that you learn and grow and learn and progress and find ways that you can improve. So that's another tip of trick that you just taught me. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
You said you worked out. What are some of your habits to keep you balanced? You can kind of get lost in your own little world writing. Like how do you stay balanced and get yourself out of that?
Well, for me, it is definitely the gym is the first kind of tool that I figured out to how to use to emotionally balance myself a lot. I started working out when I was about 20, and I started writing when I was about 21. So I've actually been working out a little bit longer than I was really writing for. It was like college writing, it was like literature writing, and that's not how I was going to become, a professional in the field. That's just not my style, and so it was not. Was a little bit more wasted effort on my part. But it took me a couple years of college to figure that out. And but yeah, I think working out is definitely the number one thing that I use to balance myself in a lot of ways. And for me, at least, I found a lot of parallels between like weightlifting and writing. I think there's a shocking number of overlaps in that, but I also think that if I had picked up playing the violin instead of lifting weights, that I would also see a shocking number of overlaps with that and writing. You find aspects of your personal life that you can start finding ways to communicate what writing means to yourself, like you figuring out to yourself and describing it to yourself in terms that you understand because of the other aspects of your life. And so I think that's important to have some stuff you pursue aside from writing, for that reason, because you have to have an expansive perspective. The more expansive perspective, the better for most folks. And the being able to keep writing in your perspective as something that it's not the whole of who you are. You're a whole person beyond that, and writing is just a tool that you use to communicate fun stories to people. Keeping it humble, I think, is really important. Like, writing is not this divine gift or anything like that. This is stories that if I wasn't a writer, I'd be telling my friends over a D&D table. Like, it's nothing too fancy. So I think it's really important to have those other pursuits that kind of help frame your professional pursuits.
Now D&D, you just mentioned it, so I'm assuming that's another thing that kind of keeps you balanced. How like how long has your group been going? Do you have is it pretty consistent?
No, not really. I mean, I hop in and out of groups occasionally. For the most part, I don't really run games. I haven't run games in a while, at least, because that headspace is, I've only got so much of it, and I'd rather get it on a page than use it on a table. But I still have a bunch of, as I'm writing more, I'm coming up with more stories that aren't appropriate for books, but would be a lot of fun to run, like over a tabletop with other players. So I'm getting more and more tempted to run a game, but for the most part, I just hop in my friends' games. I usually play some small, troublesome, mischievous character that is very Wudge-like. That's usually my go-to, because it's just a lot more fun to cause trouble than it is to solve it in a D&D game.
No, and you're right about having a headspace. Well, I don't do D&D. I do Pathfinder with my family, and I have to have like pre-written adventures, or else like it's so much harder to come up with new things while I'm trying to
Sure.
write and stuff. So
Yeah, and I also play Pathfinder. I kind of use the terms interchangeably, but to most
yeah,
laymen, they understand what D&D is. A lot of people that don't aren't in the circles don't know what Pathfinder is, so it's
right.
just simpler.
No, and I agree. And I did do D&D for a while with some of my son's friends and stuff as they were kind of getting into it, but my son has kind of taken that over and we just do like a family game. So
There you go. Yeah, I used to do D&D and Pathfinder games with my dad all the time too. He would run the game, and me and my friends would cause trouble for him and his stories constantly, which I like to think would help prepare him for his own writing endeavors.
exactly. Earlier you talked about you were planning on or you wanted to write in different genre or not different subgenres of fantasy.
Sure.
Epic, um was the it was like a
Uh,
post-apocalyptic
yeah,
and
and then
urban
the
fantasy.
urban.
So is that something you want to pursue later on in your career? Obviously, you have probably have a contract with this current series. Um,
Yeah. So I do want to continue writing the Unorthodox Chronicles. I'm not sure exactly how long I want it to be. Currently, the contract's for 3 books, but I think if the current trajectory for these 3 books continues like the first book did, that I'm pretty sure we can get some more books out of that series without too much trouble. But I've been working on developing my professional habits, and because this is the first time I've had to work under deadlines. And this book two I just finished writing was the first sequel I've ever written, which was an interesting experience. Because usually, when you're practicing, you write a book, you start over, you write a new book, you start over. You don't write sequels of the books that failed. So this is the first book that succeeded, so I had to write a sequel to it, and I'd never done that before. And so there's a bunch of new experiences even after having published my first book that I'm still kind of grappling with. And so one of them is working with deadlines and figuring out my own potential and how much I can write to how much I need to be writing to reach these deadlines. And my goal is to be able to finish a book for the most part in about 6 months, and basically have an off season that I can start writing a book for something else that's non-contractually. I really like to be putting out 2 books a year, one book in the Unorthodox Chronicles pretty consistently, and then have a second kind of slot more or less that I can just kind of write what I feel like writing, or write a second series or a different genre and kind of explore that instead. So those are kind of the first on my list to write. And I actually, before I was working on the sequel, I was focused on writing my post-apocalyptic book, and I got a decent way through it, but I'm probably going to scrap it and start over again because it just wasn't quite right. But that happens, fairly consistently. Especially for the first book in a series, because you have so much more freedom with the first book, because once you start writing the sequel, I found out you've obligated yourself to all these rules and laws and the universe you've established, and you actually have to know them and go back and make sure they're all supported. And it's such a bigger pain than it is to write just the first book where you can do whatever you want. And then I'm starting to think, now that I'm writing book 3 of the Unorthodox Chronicles, that I actually have to remember what book 2 said too. We'll see as I progress through there. I want to get this third book manuscript done, and hopefully then I'll have time before the end of the year to get a good chunk of something a new project done. I think that'd be a lot of fun.
no, and that's kind of funny because that's something you don't think about or realize. Like, oh man, now I've got a couple books contracted. Now I have to go back and reread stuff. Like, I can't imagine somebody like Brandon Sanderson getting thrown somebody a world that's not even his, right? The Wheel of Time. Like,
Yeah,
man, like he's got to go through and read all that. But granted, he was a fan beforehand, but
sure.
he's got to make sure that everything's right and everything's correct and stuff like that. Like, and I mean, people with tons and tons of books, I'm sure they have to go through and read each and every one just to refresh their memory. Because I mean, it's a world you create and stuff. But just like I've read, I've like your dad has, is it 20 books in the Dresden Files or whatever. Like I can't remember anything. Like I don't even
Yeah,
know how
he's
he
in
does
the
it.
high teens right now, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, and from most of the writers I've talked to, that's where beta readers really are a godsend, because they're the ones that they're because when you're writing it, it's like it's your craft, it's your baby, but at the same time, it's also your work. And so you to keep emotional health, you still distance yourself a little bit from it. But for your readers, ideally, it's just something that they're passionate about, and they don't need to have any of that distance, and so they can obsess over it. And you to redo this. You're not allowed to do this because you said in book 4, chapter 6, that you did this instead. And like, and while that would be annoying to a degree, it's also a lifesaver because like that's something that I would very easily overlook because I've not only am I focused on this book and the next 3 books trying to make sure they all make sense, but also each of the previous books that have been published, I have 4 or 5 different versions of them that I went through in the various iterations. I'm not sure which one made it to the book a lot of the times, just because especially as you get farther from it, you have so many versions that in your head that kind of blur together, and I find myself constantly going back like, did I say that or did I take that out, or did I remember to add that in or did I forget to add that in? I have to go back and reference myself. And so having beta readers that are people that just enjoy your books and want you to write something cool and be consistent with what you've told them in the past is fantastic for that.
So, who are some of your influences?
I would say when it comes to the actual craft of writing, the place I've learned the most from is probably Brandon Sanderson, because he is one of the writers that has gone far and away out of his way to teach people how to write books with a professional mindset. Like there's a lot of writers out there that have grandiose ways of telling you to express yourself and put yourself on the page and so on, and Brandon Sanderson is the one that actually shows you the nuts and bolts of how to do that. And he has he's gone and he taught classes at I think it was BYU, or some university. I don't want to misquote which one it is, but he's taught
BYU.
classes at is it BYU? Okay. Yeah. He taught classes there. He recorded them and put them up for free on a YouTube channel where he very easily could have, put them behind a paywall of thousands of dollars, like I think he does a lot of effort to just help people become writers for no other reason than that he wants more people to be writers. And I think that's, both very worth a lot of respect and also incredibly useful for anybody that wants to become a writer, as you might imagine. And so those courses are the number one place that I would have anybody start if they or just didn't have much of an idea going into the profession.
Yeah, and it's fun because I think that what you teach, if you see people progressing and learning and applying those things and becoming writers themselves, like that's kind of like the hall, like that's the fruit of his teachings, right? And like he's had people who have taken the class and have come out and become New York Times bestsellers and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
what he's teaching is valuable. So yeah, that's a great resource. And he actually took over the class from Dave Wolverton, aka David Farland, who was a fantastic writer and
Oh, that's
in and
right.
of himself. So in fact, Brandon took the class from David. So David taught Brandon how to write, who's passing that along to other people who are
There you
becoming
go. Yeah.
bestsellers.
Continuing the
So
tradition.
yeah, that's fantastic. And he's a great resource. He's got the Writing Excuses podcast that he used to host and so many other things that he's just been open about. So yeah, he's a great resource. Are you planning on going to any other conventions that people can meet you this year?
Yeah, the only one that I currently have on the schedule will be Dragon Con in Atlanta, and I think that's in September sometime. I don't remember exactly the date. It's right at the end of one month and on to the other so I don't remember if it was the end of September or the end of August, but it's somewhere in there.
And then your book comes out in October. Are you planning on doing any signings for that?
I might be doing a local signing here in Denver. If folks are interested, they can keep their eyes peeled. I did a meeting with the publicist group at Penguin not too long ago, and they wanted to set something up. So I let them handle those details. That's one of the nice things about having a publisher is that I can focus on just writing the books and not much else. But if I get more information about that, I'll probably put it up on my Instagram or some other social media if I can find a good venue for it.
Right. And for people who are beginning their journey, like there are pros and cons to indie publishing and traditional publishing. And that's one of them. Like if you're indie published, like you have to be in charge of everything. And so like sometimes you don't want to do all that stuff if you want to sell your book.
Yeah. If you're a control freak, go for indie publishing because you get to control every little thing. Like if you don't want people telling you that they don't like the name of that you chose for the series, and that you need to change it, like what happened to me, then I would highly recommend independent publishing. But if something like that doesn't bother you very much, like it doesn't bother me too terribly much that the name changed, like, and you want to focus more on the writing aspect, publishers are great for that.
Right. So, do you have any final tips or tricks that you can share with anybody?
I would just try to find something that you enjoy in life that isn't writing, and start making parallels between that and writing. Help yourself both, help you understand both of the aspects that you've chosen, and ways that you can enrich both areas of your life by pursuing them simultaneously.
Perfect. Now, James, go ahead and tell people how they can find your book. Obviously, it's in every major retailer, but and to find you.
Well, I'm on Instagram. That's my main social media kind of interaction thing, and it's still pretty bare. I think we touched on the fact that I'm not super social a lot of time, but I try to respond to anybody that messages me on there. I think my handle is just at James J Butcher. So if you want to follow me or just send me a message saying something about the book, feel free. And you can pick up the book, I mean, anywhere that you would expect to, really. Amazon and Barnes and Noble, a lot of, like, smaller independent bookstores, I'm sure, carry it. So just wherever you find other books, you'll probably find that one at some point.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from you.
Thank you for listening to the Troy Podcast. Please subscribe, like, and share with your friends.